Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network and also at 21stCenturyWire.com. Thank you so much for joining us for this special Sunday edition. And we're also streaming out live on X, YouTube, also at Rumble and on Facebook Live. And new live stream we're doing now, testing on BitChute, which has turned out to be a great video platform. So it's great to have all of you guys with us. The topic, of course, as you will expect, is what is happening in Syria. And it is a very serious situation indeed. There's a lot to unpack. And to do so, we are very privileged to have a guest on this week who's going to help us get a little bit of insight and perspective into what is actually happening there on the ground in the Middle East. He is the former British ambassador to Syria, and his name is Peter Ford. We're going to welcome him onto the program right now. Peter Ford, thank you so much for joining us this week on the Sunday Wire.
Well, it's good to be with you, Patrick. I just wish that the occasion was more auspicious, but we'll get into that.
Well, we can start off with the crisis itself, Peter. You know, just as we've all been trying to process what's happened in Palestine over the last 14 months, and many of us anyway, thought that the Syrian situation was somewhat stable, relatively stable, kind of, on pause. Little did we know a ceasefire was announced between Hezbollah and the Israeli forces. And the next day, we saw something, I think, that surprised a lot of people. Not everybody, but some people warned about this. A sort of blitzkrieg, I think, is the best way to describe it. In 24 hours, Aleppo was in the hands of al-Qaeda, HTS, FSA, all the acronyms together. Let's just call it al-Qaeda in Syria for simplicity's sake. The opposition fighters, the mainstream media in the West, Peter. Again, the rebels. These are now rebels. Al-Qaeda has been rebranded. We'll talk about that. First of all, Peter, what was your initial feelings, your reaction of what's happened over the last week or so?
Utter shock, Patrick. I have to confess, this took me total surprise. But I should have known better. We should all have known better. I mean, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but there were harbingers, omens, that something bad was going to happen. And the most important sign was the breakdown of long drawn-out negotiations on normalization between Syria and Turkey. These had been rumbling on in a desultory way for the best part of a year, with the Turks growing increasingly frustrated at the unwillingness of the Assad government to make the concessions that the Turks were demanding. Now, the nature of those concessions hasn't been made public, but they certainly included a continuing presence for Turkish troops in Idlib and all the way across Syria's northern border. And Syria rejected this on principle. And this was the main sticking point. Well, it seems that Erdogan was becoming increasingly desperate. Why? Because of the presence of 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. As a result, by the way, of Erdogan's own irresponsible, reckless action in encouraging and giving succor to the jihadists over the course of the Syrian conflict. The result was that 3.5 million Syrians, mainly families, fighters related to the jihadis, fled across the border into Turkey. And these have become a massive, massive problem in Turkish politics, to the extent where the issue has put the future of the Erdogan regime in the balance. So Erdogan was becoming increasingly desperate to be able to decant these millions of Syrian refugees back across the border whence they came. But that wasn't going to be possible as long as the Assad forces controlled the area. Erdogan was also increasingly frustrated at the actions of the Kurds, who are ensconced further to the east from the Idlib stronghold of the jihadis. So for these two urgent reasons, I think Erdogan took the decision, well, if I'm not going to be able to negotiate the concessions I need, I will unleash my dogs of war. And that's what he did. And is probably being surprised by the ease with which the dogs have been able to cut through to the gates of Homs. Now, there are several reasons why they found it so easy. It's a bit like, asking what was the cause of the First World War. Well, there were a lot, deep-seated and more proximate causes. But one proximate cause was Lebanon, which you just mentioned, and the fact that Hezbollah, which had helped massively to stabilize and pacify Syria, was seriously damaged by the Israeli attacks on Lebanon. And Hezbollah has been forced in recent months to withdraw some of its own forces who were in northern Syria. So this was one of the proximate causes. A more long-term cause has been the way Syria has been impoverished over more than a decade by Western sanctions, deliberately designed to make life difficult for the Syrian armed forces in their struggle against the jihadis. Things like fuel in particular, scarcity of fuel, poor electricity service, supplies of all kinds have been hampered for a very, very long time, with the result that the Syrian government has been on its uppers, unable to maintain a large standing army, forced to release many of the more experienced soldiers, go back to their villages to help their impoverished families, and instead rely on not very well equipped, trained, or motivated conscripts. So this was a disaster that could have been foreseen. I'm not sure it could have been preempted. I don't see how, in the circumstances, the Syrian army could have been much better placed, given the way it's been run down. And I can understand why Assad was very reluctant to make the concessions demanded by Erdogan, which would have amounted to a de facto power sharing in northern Syria, or even partition, something like the northern Cyprus situation, which has lasted 50 years. One can't blame a Syrian president who's seen his country dismembered in the historic past. The province of Alexandretta was given by France when France was the mandatory power in Syria in the 1920s. The French gave away a slice of Syrian coastline to Turkey already. And of course, the Israelis have been sitting on the Golan for more than 50 years. So the country has already been, to some extent, dismembered. And that appears if the Turks have their way, to be Syria's fate in the coming years.
Well, let me bring this map up on screen here. Apologies, it's from the Institute of Study of War, not my favorite think tank, Peter, but it really tells the story of what you're just describing there. The purple area you see in the northeast there, in the upper right-hand corner, that's occupied by the United States military and its Kurdish SDF proxies, you could say.
Well, of course, among the deep-seated causes was the role of the US, firstly in de facto occupying those oil-rich and grain-rich parts of Syria, which cut the Syrian economy off at the knees. And by their mere presence, those scanty numbers of American forces, but with the US Air Force just over the horizon, if they were challenged, the Americans managed to stop Syria getting control of its own natural resources. And instead, the money went, some of it to Turkey, some of it to Iraqi Kurdistan, and some of it to propping up the administration of the area controlled by the Americans with their Kurdish surrogates. Of course, the United States has also been doing its best to arrange regime change through the sanctions that we've just mentioned. And of course, the US has also been helping Israel with its many bombing raids on Syria, which were becoming, as this year progressed, almost daily, and played an important role in demoralizing the Syrian army and destroying the infrastructure of that army. So it's been sort of death by 1,000 cuts on poor Syria.
I've seen this so many times before, Peter, whereby a country that's being targeted by sanctions, economic warfare, currency has been attacked, the economy's been attacked, they've been embargoed, strangled effectively. I think few can argue that's what's happened to Syria, and they've been under that regime now, this pincer between the EU and the United States in terms of an embargo, with Israel enforcing those sanctions by airstrikes effectively, by making the border with Iraq and Syria non-functional and attacking Lebanon and Syrian border crossings. So really isolating and choking the country off. But then in the media, in the political conversation, Peter, and obviously you're the former ambassador to Syria for Great Britain, everyone's blaming Assad. They say, "Oh, the economy's in shambles. Assad must go. He's made a wreck of it. It's the Assad family oligarchy, and this is why the country is in shambles. He needs to go. And if al-Qaeda is going to do the job for us, according to Jake Sullivan and others, well, so be it. That's probably a practical option for us. We'll take it." Basically, I mean, this blaming of Assad for the balkanization of the country, for the sanctions, for all of these things, for what Turkey's ambitions are in the region, what Israel's doing in terms of its land theft agenda with the Golan Heights. Everyone's blaming Assad and demonizing him as a brutal dictator, the butcher of Damascus. You know the whole drill. To me, it's extraordinary because I've never seen a case of total warfare against one country than we've seen with Syria in the last 15 years. Your thoughts on this, Peter?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And when any attempt has been made to call the British government to account for these sanctions and the impact on ordinary people, they tell blatant lies. They say, "Oh, there are humanitarian exceptions made." This is a total lie because of the mechanics of sanctions. The main way it works is that the Assad government can't get its hands on US dollars. And if you can't trade in US dollars, you're dead, more or less, in the Middle East. Only if you're a near superpower like Russia or China can you get round it. So this is the main reason why Syria has had no fuel, as well as no food and no parts for hospital equipment and everything else besides. It's the restriction on Syria's ability to trade in dollars, which has brought the economy to its knees. But of course, it suits the British government and the American government and the EU government to pretend that just because on paper there are humanitarian exceptions, which turn out actually to be exceptions designed to help the jihadi enclave of Idlib rather than the Syrian people as a whole. Their only humanitarian concern is for the jihadi enclave. I just now, watching the news, I was struck by a fresh example of the double standards and the way Assad gets blamed for everything. That one of the mainstream news channels was reporting that 300,000 people were fleeing the north because they're afraid of being bombed by Assad. What? This is the diametrical opposite of the truth. They are fleeing because they're terrified for their lives. That they are generally Christians or Alawites, Druze, Kurds, terrified that these jihadis are going to be butchering them. But no, the British media, mainstream media, pretend that it's all Assad's fault.
And that's, you brought up another important point, Peter. I'll bring the map up back on here. In the northwest part, you have the Idlib province. And, you know, Peter, it wasn't long ago that the greatest evil on the planet Earth was ISIS. This was the obsession, the fetish, if you will, of the mainstream media constantly, that we have to give up our rights at home. We need to deploy more military to the Middle East to deal and to defeat ISIS, because we can't allow them to establish a caliphate. Such extremists, we can't allow them to establish a caliphate in the Middle East, because it would be terrible for the ethnic minorities and just generally for stability in the region. But Peter, you know, people don't mention the fact that they actually did establish this caliphate. It's called Idlib. This is effectively an al-Qaeda occupied territory inside Syria that it seems like it's given material support and a lot of political cover from Turkey, if I'm not mistaken on that. So that is the ISIS caliphate that Trump said never took shape and he defeated. It wasn't defeated. And these fighters are interchangeable between the Syrian Free Syrian Army, the Syrian National Army, the HTS, al-Qaeda, ISIS. They're all interchangeable. But there it is in gray on the map, Peter. You know, that is the Islamic State that everybody, we were, you know, the world went on hold for like a year or two because of ISIS. But nobody mentioned the fact that and that's where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi fled. That was his residency of last resort, was Idlib. Not a word of this. Is this part of an intentional PR strategy by the West to kind of whitewash what's really happened here?
Absolutely. It's selective amnesia. They want to forget everything that they used to say about ISIS. And they don't want to accept that HTS is simply a laundered ISIS. Very many of the same personnel, including the leader al-Julani himself, who was there 10 years ago as a prominent leader of ISIS before he reinvented himself in a breakaway group of al-Qaeda and then went through several more launderings to emerge as the cuddly rebel being interviewed by CNN today. And one aspect of the emerging story, which is being oddly ignored by the mainstream, is the release of ISIS prisoners. One of the first things the jihadis did when they got into Hama was to throw the doors of the jail open, and among the many prisoners will have been very many ISIS fighters who will no doubt promptly have joined their fellow jihadis. And here's another thing. You would normally expect the British media in particular to be very, very interested in the fate of ISIS prisoners in one of the main prisons up there in the Kurdish area. And because of the presence of the famous ISIS bride, Shamima Begum. She's constantly, news about her is constantly in the rabid British media, because there were suggestions she might be got out and brought back. Well, she's on the point of being liberated by al-Jolani. His forces must now be within miles of this hopefully still Kurdish-controlled camp of al-Hol, which has about 10,000 jihadis, plus all their numerous offspring, jihadis, budding jihadis who've grown up knowing nothing different. It's a township of about 50,000 people. And the way things are going, HTS and their allies, the so-called Free Syrian Army, will be throwing open the gates of this mass prison. Not a word in the British media.
Well, the same thing happened in the run-up to July 2014. There was a series of jailbreaks in different countries, and significant numbers. And of course, surprise, surprise, we had this giant manifestation of an ISIS army that just basically marauded its way around like privateers through Iraq and Syria, and the rest is history. Same exact conditions, Peter, as you've laid out, are happening now, as well as in around Al-Tanf, where coincidentally the United States are well encamped. No surprise there. They're been coexisting with ISIS remnants and their families in this area for quite some time. So, Peter, it almost seems to me like with Donald Trump coming in January, this is going to be perfect timing for the emergence of ISIS, or the re-release of ISIS, to give America that righteous good fight that they've been so desperately looking for and have failed to find in Ukraine, and this disaster of a genocide in Israel. This looks like it could be the perfect storm for the reemergence of the black flag and an American eagle to hunt down ISIS again, Donald Trump being the man. Do you see that as a possibility on the political end of things?
Well, it could go the other way. I take your point, but Donald Trump is the man who wanted to withdraw U.S. forces from Syria, tried twice and was thwarted twice by the deep state and the Israel lobby. And just breaking news this afternoon, I see Trump off his own bat, not in response to a question, put out a tweet saying, it's not our fight. We shouldn't get involved in what's going on in Syria. Now that's a bit cryptic because, of course, America is already involved up to the hilt in ways we've just described. But I think it gives a slight cause for hope that Trump will not let himself be deceived this time, and will indeed want, if not to get out, at least not to meddle. This will be a tall task, but actually, it would be a good thing in the short term for Western powers to be more panicked about ISIS. They need to be woken up and hoist by their own petard. They can't row backwards on what they said about ISIS. These new jihadis must be called out for what they are, the new ISIS, a bit like New Labour, Tony Blair's new Labour. This is the HTS are the new ISIS. They must be called out on that, and the Western publics must be made alarmed about this. Currently apathetic because the dangers are not being pointed out to them. But I would like to whip up more panic about ISIS. And this is obviously a result of our own actions. We designed the sanctions and the pummeling of Assad over the years precisely to create a situation like this in which the jihadis could make a takeover bid. Well, we're about possibly to get our way, and once again we'll discover, as we did in Afghanistan when we helped in the takeover of the Taliban from the Russians, we may find that you should be careful what you wish for.
And there's a real effort already. CNN, of course, has got camera crews on the ground in Aleppo showing this news kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion utopia that HTS is promising. And Jilani himself fawning interviews by CNN. Rebel leader says goal is to overthrow the regime. So you have a mainstream media, Peter, in the West openly backing an al-Qaeda regime change to overthrow a UN sovereign member state, not batting an eyelid about the gravity of such a scenario as and the horrors of it, potentially, of what you've just described, Peter. Not a problem at all with that. And then meanwhile, Jolani himself has been given this kind of Hollywood makeover, which is quite incredible here. We'll bring this up on screen. Just a little bit of a resemblance there, Peter, that is quite striking. The green outfit is very much like Zelensky. They're really fashioning a type of a rebrand here. This is a killer, former understudy of Baghdadi himself at ISIS, sent with bags of cash to Syria to start the movement there, which he successfully did, thanks to the United States, who let him off the leash in Iraq, Peter. So, I mean, I find this to be incredible. I've got a clip here of this CNN. Well, just a minute of this CNN interview, which is, there's no irony present here at all. It's just totally normal. We've got the al-Qaeda head here. Isn't he a lovely man? And these are his plans to be a democratic reformer in Syria. Let's take a quick listen.
Taking Hama, after taking Aleppo, I mean, how significant is this for you right now?
From a military perspective, what comes after Hama will not be the same as what came before. However, I prefer not to be overly optimistic during the battle. I like to remain cautious and vigilant to avoid complacency and ensure we don't suffer losses while believing we are safe.
What comes after this? What's after Hama?
The course of the battle, as for the secrets of the battle, let's leave them to the unfolding events. You will witness them in reality, which is better than discussing them now.
In a matter of days.
So the philosopher king here being unveiled by the Western media, Peter. I mean, what a Hollywood style makeover they're giving this guy. Incredible.
Well, there's sort of method in the madness, because when was al-Qaeda last an enemy of the United States? After the great event of 9/11, when did al-Qaeda mount any significant attack on the United States? There were attacks in Europe, but you have to go back nearly 20 years. ISIS also, apart from some Lone Ranger type attacks, what did ISIS actually do beyond beheading a few unfortunate American citizens? No, these groups have never actually been very interested in attacking America. What they're interested in is attacking Syria, taking control of the beating heart of the Arab world, as it's been described. Syria is the prize for control of the Levant and the wider Middle East. I mean, the clue is in the name, ISIS, the Islamic State for Iraq and the Levant. That's what they're interested in, even though officially their ideology was for a wider Ummah control of just about the whole world. Specifically, they were only concerned with Syria and Iraq. And al-Qaeda are no different. Least of all are they concerned about attacking Israel. Quite the reverse. I was going to say that they are de facto allies, but that implies that there's no coordination. But clearly there is, and there are now there's open boasting about how they've worked with Israel. So it's rather odd that even some Palestinians are deluded enough to think that what's happening in Syria is somehow going to be good for Muslims and Palestinians when it's the opposite.
And on that point, we're starting to see a whole slew of articles in the Israeli press about how willing to normalize relations with the al-Qaeda occupied Aleppo areas and so forth. I'll give you a couple of samples here. Syrian rebel commander urges Israel to support the uprising, strike Iran-backed forces. IDF bolsters forces on Syrian border. We're talking about the Golan Heights there, as rebels appear set to capture Homs. So it's a funny game Israel's playing here. They're saying that, well, we're moving into the Golan Heights because we're afraid of the instability of these rebels capturing Homs, when in fact they're absolutely coordinating this pincer movement against Damascus, but Israel's selling this as they're concerned about terrorism. So they're almost bringing in the rubric of the war on terror, but at the same time, opening up cordial relations with what they call the rebels here. I mean, this is like beyond Orwellian at this point, Peter, but it seems like there's this, real normalization of, these al-Qaeda HTS factions with Israel, even so much, Peter, I don't know if you saw this, but promising to lift sanctions in the areas that were occupied by the rebels. So it's in punishing the rest of Syria that is not surrendering to al-Qaeda. I mean, I know I'm oversimplifying things a little bit, Peter, but that's kind of like, if you really lay it out, that's almost basically what's happening. Your thoughts?
Well, this is what the Western powers have been trying to engineer for over a decade. They were never reconciled to the victory or near total victory of Syria. They continued to harp on about the need for what they call euphemistically a transition, meaning regime change, of course, with no place for the Assad government. And now they've got what they wanted. They were never concerned about who would take over. They've not just been willfully blind, they have secretly longed for this to happen, because it was any fool could predict that this was what was going to happen, and not the emergence of a group of doctors and candlestick makers and other civilians who would take over the reins of government. This is what the Western governments have been angling for, the creation of an al-Qaeda state which would be under their thumb, which would be a new client for them. And so they have a bit of laundering to do.
So you probably saw also reports by Arab League members like Saudi Arabia and even the UAE wanting to meet with leaders in the Arab world, in Syria too, saying that they support Syria in their war on terror. Qatar is obviously separate from this conversation because they're backing the rebels on this with Turkey. But what do you make of this change of direction? Because these are all the same GCC countries that helped to destabilize and destroy Syria 10 years ago. Have they changed their mind? Are they afraid of what might be unleashed here? Or is this typical Arab League wishy-washy diplomacy here? What do you make of that?
Well, the key here is Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is probably exercising its usual caution. It will not be happy about a victory for Qatar. This looms very, very large in Saudi calculations, and the opposite is true for Qatar. Both these countries are more concerned with doing down each other than almost any other issue at all. So the Saudis will not be happy to see a sort of victory for Qatar and more power to Al Jazeera and Al Qatar's elbow and the Muslim brothers who are part of the Qatari network. Just as the Saudis had strong reservations about Hamas. So I think the Saudis will be, at the very least, hedging their bets. They will not be swiftly coming forward to express any kind of support for these jihadis, and I think they will be hoping that the Russians can come in to exercise some adult supervision. They will also be anxious not to get across Iran, which demonstrated in 2019 a capacity to strike Saudi Arabia painfully with a drone attack on Saudi refinery, after which Saudi sobered up in its anti-Iranian jihad and has now become an interlocutor for Iran. The UAE has been more anti-Iranian because there's a territory dispute, the contested islands in the Gulf, and the UAE being weaker, smaller than Saudi Arabia, is also more pervious to American pressure. But neither of these, in the current situation, matter terribly much, nor does the Arab League. This is only the military situation matters now, and to some extent, the information battle space. Are ISIS, al-Qaeda going to be accepted? Are we going to connive at laundering their reputations? This is an awkward one for the Western powers. Of course, they have massive resources in the mainstream media, but there is instinctive reluctance, and events like the freeing of ISIS prisoners is going to cause alarm, even if the media try to mask its significance. And there will be reports, videos coming out about gruesome massacres, that there will be missteps by individual jihadis, women, gays will not be left alone for long. And then there's the Kurds, another of the pets that the West have coddled. They're being attacked by the jihadis. The US has a particularly big investment in the Kurds and the Kurds women's regiment, who will be in the line of fire. So it's a complex situation. And of course, it's changing almost by the hour. By the hour, one hesitates to make predictions. But I would say I expect the fight back to begin, possibly as early as today. I believe there was an important meeting in Doha. The Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, and the Qataris met at foreign minister level, and I would expect some kind of deal to be attempted over the heads of Syria, the Syrian government and the Syrian people. I would not be surprised if Russia put it to Erdogan that unless he settled for very watered down terms in terms of a Turkish buffer zone along that northern stretch of territory and called back the dogs of war, then the Russians were going to unleash all their own forces, which so far they've been holding back.
And so, can you compare the situation to where we were in like 2014, 2015? I mean, Damascus had lost effectively operational control of huge amount, 80% of their territory at that time. And then somehow we're able to turn the tides with the help of Russia, Hezbollah, Iranian special forces, and so forth. The Syrian Army got a second wind. It's a very, the speed of this, Peter, in the last 2 weeks has just been lightning. And that's caught a lot of people. It's blown a lot of people off balance on this. Do you think the situation, would you say right now it's more dire than in 2014? Or are we looking at a different world, a different battlefield with different capabilities and players?
Well, there are some reasons to be more pessimistic. I was there when ISIS were literally at the gates of Damascus. But possibly the Syrian army is weaker today than it was back then, after all that's happened in the intervening years in terms of the pummeling from different sides, the sanctions. There's also technology, new drone warfare that the Turks have given to the jihadis, and the Ukrainians, it seems, have provided training on quite effective drones, which sort of changed the equation. So unfortunately, there are differences in the situation between 2014, 2015, and now. But Syria and its armed forces have always been very resilient. And when their backs are to the wall, they come out at their best. Things have been moving so fast that the Syrians have been caught off guard. But if they can just hold the line and get their breath back and wait for the Russian cavalry and more help from Iran, then I think they will fight back successfully, and we'll see a replay of the Syrian recovery 2015 to 2019.
Well, also, Peter, I might add here that you said Iran. Iran's role in the Middle East has changed dramatically. They have increased their deterrence and their status by orders of magnitude after slapping Israel twice in the last year, in April and October, with huge missile salvos. Now that no one's ever seen that before in the region. Do you think what would be the kind of calculus from Iran? Let's say Israel decides to invade and occupy more of the Golan Heights and head into Syrian territory. Does that expose Israel to maybe an massive Iranian missile attack or something like this? I'm just wondering, because this wasn't even in the conversation 10 years ago, but now it might be in play. What do you think?
Well, I think the Golan is just a distraction, and a lot of people are devising schemes to divide the attention of the axis of resistance as it applies to Syria. I'm not sure any talk about the Golan is actually true, but the aim may be to ensure that Syrian troops in the area of the Golan don't take up positions closer to Damascus, which they probably ought to do. There are limits to what Iran can do. But the most immediately useful thing will be to get the militia that it supports in Iraq across those hundreds of miles. And at a time when they've been shot at by US forces, that's not a straightforward proposition. But I don't think we can look forward to seeing Iranian troops. I don't think they've been ever in numbers in Syria. There have been experts, but not huge numbers of Iranians. And Iran's missiles are not very helpful in this situation, unless they were trained on Ankara, perhaps, but I'm being fanciful. But they couldn't train them on Aleppo, for example, or even Idlib. Iran's strengths can't really be brought to bear here. One of their major contributions, of course, has been money. They've effectively been paying for the Syrian army, and I was pleased to see President Assad announce a pay increase for the army a few days ago. That will need Iranian help, I'm sure. The Russians have a greater capability, and it was the Russians effectively who turned the tide in 2015. They can do a lot more, and they can press more levers, and they can apply more pressure to Turkey. Ultimately, what's needed is for Erdogan to yank on the leash of al-Qaeda, draw them back to the border. That seems quite hard to imagine now, but they're utterly dependent on Turkey for everything. Utterly dependent. They're a creature of Turkey. So given enough incentives, Erdogan, who claims to support Syrian sovereignty, he can call them back.
And you mentioned before the Iraqi militias, the PMUs, the Hashd al-Shabi. I'm going to bring this map up on screen here, Peter. Kind of a big picture of the region here, removing a few borders. And really, these are the supply routes from Iran all the way to Beirut. And of course, as you can see in the middle there, Peter, that is such an important border, the Iraqi-Syria border, with Deir ez-Zor and all of these key regions. Abu Kamal as well, very key. Of course, this is where you'd expect ISIS to manifest along these areas as well, to prevent that cross-border that maintains the axis of resistance supply lines all the way to southern Lebanon, Peter. So, as far as Israel and the United States concerned, is this the map that they're the most concerned about here?
Yes, it will be a major concern of the Americans and of course, the Israelis to block all of those routes, but particularly the bases in the area of Homs, which have been the staging posts for the delivery of Iranian aid to Lebanon and to Hezbollah specifically. And unfortunately, it appears that the airbase called T4 near Homs is under threat. And this will severely, if it falls, it will severely hamper Iranian methods of replenishing Hezbollah. Maybe this is for another program or another segment, but it will tend to trigger a fresh round in the Lebanese conflict, because the Israelis will be emboldened, to use a word that a favorite term usually used against Iran. It's always Iran or China or Russia that are being emboldened. Well, this time it's Israel, which is being emboldened very much at the moment to try another round in Lebanon. Already they've been making a mockery of the so-called ceasefire. It must be doubtful whether they ever seriously intended to implement it. But now, with Hezbollah so severely weakened and facing the prospect of losing its lifeline to Tehran, the Israelis must be fancying their chances.
And you mentioned again the issue of Lebanon there. We bring the main map of Syria and Lebanon up on screen here. And Peter, this area of northern Lebanon with Tripoli, there was intense fighting along those border regions previously with ISIS involving the Lebanese armed forces and Hezbollah. There seemed to be an effort to want to punch through there to Tripoli, and there's maybe you could say more of let's say sympathetic Sunni population in Tripoli in terms of what's going on in Syria, supporting the revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood aspect, which you said as well. What about that? Because it seems like Lebanon can't escape this conflict if it accelerates. There are a lot of Lebanese that are on certain quarters. They're happy to see Assad go, and by hook or crook. But is Lebanon going to be safe, Peter, from the hostilities if things progress in the way they are right now in Syria? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Lebanon must be very afraid. And this is reason for hope, actually, because the Lebanese people as a whole are very tired of conflict. The last thing they want is spillover. So surprisingly, there wasn't a lot of resentment against Hezbollah for the recent conflict. There's some, certainly, but bottom line, people, politicians, militias in Lebanon have not wanted to take advantage of Hezbollah's weakness. They did not listen to Netanyahu's blandishments to Lebanese to rise against Hezbollah, seize the moment. But as you mentioned, northern Lebanon was a hotbed of jihadi activity. And if the jihadis come to control the adjoining areas, that will bode very badly for Lebanon.
And we can't have a Syrian conversation without acknowledging the reemergence of guess who? The white helmets are back, dusted off, back into action. The favorite Western media troupe. I'll play one of their recent releases. This came out straight away as things were kicking off in Aleppo. We've got a short white helmet film here. We'll take a look at this, and I'll get your comment as well.
يلا تعالوا 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 ما في شيء ما في شيء يحكون عنا وين في جوا شيء في حدا معترف يلا يلا في حدا شيء لا ما تم رجال معي حاطي معي يلا 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 اختي قاعد خد شوي.
So, Peter, I mean, after 14 months of watching the most horrific bombing scenes of civilians in Gaza with real first responders that didn't have any resources or money, digging out bodies by hand, and here come the white helmets, pristine outfits, high-def cameras. I mean, this is a really important part of the whole PR matrix, though. And it's also a great recruiting tool, isn't it, for foreign fighters? Certainly, we saw that with Ukraine in the last couple of years. But your comments on the relaunch, if you will, of the white helmets.
Well, the relaunch is a particularly British maneuver. I mean, the white helmets were a British creation. Their founder, James Le Mesurier, was a former British intelligence agent. This is well known. And they have been the spearhead of British anti-Syria propaganda. They've been quiescent, of course, for several years, but they've been quickly brought out of mothballs. And in no time, as you point out, that they are there ready with their modern equipment and with a supine Western media and Arab media very ready to relay their fabricated images. And our own dear Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, was supposed to meet, I'm not sure where, but was supposed to meet a white helmet representative roundabout now. So the white helmets are very much the spearhead of a propaganda effort, multifaceted. They must be a bit frustrated because they haven't had more bombings where they could appear. There's been relatively, a bit like the Ukrainians somehow didn't produce their own white helmets, but that's another question. But there will, in the days to come, I'm sure, as the Syrians fight back with Russian assistance, there will be ample opportunities. And then we'll have our old favorite, the chemical weapons that the white helmets must be checking supplies of as we speak.
I'm glad you brought that up, Peter, because not to be disappointed, the Israelis warned just a few days ago that they're very concerned about an imminent chemical weapons attack, either by the opposition or by the Syrian government, or that the al-Qaeda would be able to possess, take into their possession Syrian chemical weapons stocks. So the Israelis seem to know something that the rest of the international community don't know, that somehow Assad is harboring WMDs, but they're going to intervene in Syria if they find out that that's the case. And of course, what happened yesterday? Here's Ilan Levy, the spokesperson, unofficial or official of the IDF. The IDF have attacked chemical weapons stockpiles in Syria to prevent them from falling into the hands of the rebels. Israel keeps the world safe. And we predicted this just 2 days before, because the white helmets were at the UN Security Council saying this exact script, that we're concerned about an imminent chemical weapons attack. And then Israel comes and announces they're concerned. And 2 days later, Peter, here we go. They've used this as a pretext to hit military facilities in these key positions that we're talking about in Syria. So between the white helmets and now the Israelis, totally coordinated on messaging, this is military strategy, Peter, but done with this kind of PR element and humanitarian element. It's an incredible operation. Go ahead.
Yes, it's death by 1,000 cuts for poor Syria. They seem to stand little chance, surrounded as they are by so many powerful enemies. The amazing thing is that over 11 years now of conflict, they've managed to survive, but they're facing perhaps their biggest battle now, and their enemies are stronger. The Israelis more able to intervene openly. Now, after Gaza, there are absolutely no limits on what Israel can do anywhere they like in the Middle East. So poor Syria is facing an even more daunting array of enemies and being stabbed in the back all the time. Those US forces in Al-Tanf that you mentioned, unleashing their ISIS guards, and their guards are ex-ISIS, I say ex, sleeper cells of ISIS. Their guards in the oil camps, it's well known, are former ISIS. So they're being stabbed in the back from every angle.
And we're going to wrap it up in a moment, this segment, Peter. And again, I'm really thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this breaking situation that, of course, is it's a lot of people are upset by it, shocked by it. Some people are cheering for the overthrow of the Syrian government, and it brings up another tricky question. And I kind of want to get your take. And I don't know if you've thought about it, but we saw this 10 years ago, and then it kind of went away. But when Israel started pounding Gaza after October 7th, there was this total unity in terms of Palestinian solidarity coming from all angles. Absolutely everybody was there. And then in the last 2 weeks, we've seen this split. And this split is along sectarian lines, and the idea that Assad is an enemy of the Sunnis, and that there is a faction of Palestinian supporters and some Palestinians resistance, apparently, at least previously anyway, that are supposedly against Syria and want to see the overthrow of Assad. So you've got this wedge that's driven in there on the Palestinian issue. I'm just going to ask, have you noticed this? Have you observed this over the years? And what's behind this? Or is this easy to explain? Your thoughts on this, Peter?
Well, I'm sorry to say it, but the Palestinians have only themselves to blame for this. Hamas themselves, although they've been given every assistance by Syria and, as the West used to say, harbored by Syria, when the going got tough at the beginning of the Syrian conflict, Hamas left their Damascus offices and settled in Qatar and Turkey and sided against Syria, despite Syria having been their biggest backer for many years. This was treachery. There's no other word for it. As Syria made progress in the conflict, after several years, Hamas slunk back and made a sort of peace with Syria. They didn't come back to reside in Damascus. They were too well provided for in Doha. But they made their peace with Damascus. And Damascus, were they wise, were ready to make peace with Hamas. Today, Hamas appears to be taking a neutral stance. I saw a statement to that effect a couple of days ago. What's left of Hamas today is in no position to take much of a position on anything other than its own survival. So at least they're not openly siding with the jihadis, but the wider Palestinian community willfully ignores the sacrifices that Syria made over many years, ignores the fact that Hezbollah suffered near death just for going to Hamas's rescue in a small way. It's unforgivable. It's unforgivable on the part of any Palestinian that they should be with these jihadis. It's shocking.
And it seems like the United States, the European politicians and media, Israel are more than happy and quite wanting to help drive that wedge in and promote those types of sectarian talking points. I see a lot more of this Sunni Shia, even Tulsi Gabbard, who was nominally the anti-war movement leader in America, really pushing this sectarian narrative of there's these irreconcilable differences between Sunni and Shia, and that's the cause of extremism and terror, and that's the number one threat. And Islam is the number one threat, and so forth. We're seeing a resurgence of this, and it's painful, Peter, because it's like, have we not learned these lessons from the Iraq War, from the past, the post 9/11 era? What a unmitigated disaster that was, foreign policy wise, for the West. And like, I feel like, Peter, we're back here again. We have to litigate these lessons. But your final thoughts, and we'll wrap this segment up. Again, thank you for joining us. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, it's hard to identify many reasons for optimism, but I mentioned earlier the deal that I thought might be done over Syria's head. And Russia and Turkey, between them, are in a position to settle this issue, not on terms that would be accepted by an independent Syrian government, but which may be imposed on it purely in the interest of survival. So I think that possibly the best hope rests there in dreadful as it would be to create a de facto North Cyprus type situation in poor, already dismembered Syria. But this may be the lesser evil.
Yeah. I was just talking about the Cyprus issue just last week with one of our friends in the media who's based there. Incredible that all these years later, still unresolved, Peter, but yeah, it could be a slightly better option than the worst that everyone can imagine. But Peter Ford, former UK ambassador to Syria, and also with the Workers' Party of Britain as well. We really appreciate you joining us on the Sunday Wire this week. Thank you for coming.
It's been a pleasure, Patrick. Anytime.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Peter Ford. Ladies and gentlemen, what a great conversation. Of course, we're going to be taking a break real quick, and we are coming back with an overdrive segment, and we're going to be joined by a couple of usual suspects to talk about this and other important issues that are breaking right now. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. We'll be right back after this short break.